The dust kicked up by 50 pairs of boots hung thick in the air like a dirty cloud over Millfield's town square. It was the kind of hot September day that made men sweat through their shirts and women fan themselves with whatever they could find. But today wasn't about the heat. Today was about business. The kind of business that decent folk didn't talk about in church on Sundays. A wooden platform sat in the center of the square, built high enough so everyone could see what was being sold. Horses, cattle, farm equipment. That was the usual fare. But not today. Today, something different stood on those weathered planks. Something that made the crowd press closer with hungry eyes and cruel smiles. She stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from fear itself. The burlap sack covered her head completely, tied tight around her neck with rough rope that had left red marks on her pale skin. Her hands were bound behind her back with the same coarse rope, and she swayed slightly, as if she might faint. The plain brown dress she wore was torn in places, dirty from travel, but it couldn't hide the fact that underneath that sack was a woman worth fighting for. Gentlemen, gentlemen! The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square like a carnival barker selling tickets to a freak show. His name was Pike, and he'd been selling everything from pigs to people for more years than anyone cared to count. His face was red from whiskey and sun. His belly hung over his belt like a sack of flour, and his smile showed more gaps than teeth. What we have here is a fine specimen of womanhood. Young, strong, perfect for any man's needs. The crowd roared its approval. Miners with dirt under their fingernails pressed forward. Ranchers in dusty hats nodded and spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Drifters with nothing to lose except a few coins in their pockets whistled and shouted suggestions that would make a preacher blush. She can cook, clean, work the fields, and warm your bed on cold nights. Pike continued, his voice getting louder as the crowd got more excited. What am I bid for this prime piece of merchandise? $50, shouted a bearded man in overalls. He owned a pig farm outside town and hadn't seen a woman in 3 years. 60, called out another voice from the back. This one belonged to a mining foreman who'd been drinking since breakfast and had more money than sense. The woman on the platform flinched at each bid, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a windstorm. She couldn't see the faces leering at her, but she could hear the hunger in their voices. She could feel their eyes crawling over her like insects. 75. The bids kept climbing as men pushed and shoved to get a better look. Some made crude comments about what they'd do with her. Others just stood there with their arms crossed, calculating how much work they could get out of her before she broke. That's when he appeared. Samuel Hayes didn't push through the crowd like the others. He didn't have to. Men simply stepped aside when they saw him coming, the way sheep move for a wolf. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out his black coat like he was born wearing it. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face had the kind of lines that come from squinting into too many sunsets. But it was his eyes that made people nervous. They were the color of winter sky, cold and distant, like they'd seen things no man should have to see. He walked slow and steady, his spurs clicking against the packed dirt with each step. His right hand rested easy on the gun at his hip, not threatening, just there, available. The crowd grew quiet as he moved through them, conversations dying like candle flames in the wind. Pike noticed him too and grinned wider, sensing fresh money. Well, Mr. Hayes, come to bid on our lovely lady. Samuel said nothing. He just stood there at the edge of the platform, looking up at the woman with those cold eyes. But somehow, the coldness seemed different now. Not cruel, but protective, like ice forming over deep water. Do I hear 80? Pike called out, trying to get the bidding started again. 80, someone shouted from the side. 90, called another. The bids flew fast and furious now. Men trying to outdo each other, their voices getting louder and more desperate. The woman on the platform swayed again, and for a moment it looked like she might fall. Her breathing was quick and shallow, the burlap sack moving in and out like she was suffocating. 125. The latest bid came from Jake Thornton, a man who owned half the businesses in town and wanted to own the other half. He was short and thick like a tree stump, with small eyes that never missed anything and hands that took whatever they wanted. He stood near the front of the crowd in his expensive suit, looking pleased with himself. Pike was about to call for higher bids when a voice cut through the noise like a knife through butter. $500. The words were spoken quietly, but in the sudden silence, they sounded loud as thunder. Every head turned towards Samuel Hayes. Even the woman on the platform seemed to sense something had changed, her trembling slowing to a stop. I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. Pike stammered, his showman's confidence cracking like ice in spring. Did you say 500? I did. Samuel's voice was calm, steady, like he was ordering coffee instead of buying a human being. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. $500 was more money than most of these men saw in 2 years. It was crazy money, desperate money, the kind of money that made people ask questions. Jake Thornton's face turned red as a tomato. His small eyes narrowed to slits as he stared at Samuel. That's a lot of money for a woman you ain't even seen, Hayes. Samuel turned those winter-cold eyes on Thornton and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. I've got a lot of money, Jake, and I don't much care what you think about how I spend it. The two men stared at each other across the crowd, and everyone could feel the tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Thornton's hand twitched toward his gun, then stopped. He might be mean, but he wasn't stupid. Samuel Hayes had a reputation, and it wasn't the kind that involved backing down from fights. Pike cleared his throat loudly, trying to break the tension. Well then, do I hear any other bids? Going once, going twice. No one spoke. $500 might as well have been $5,000. The crowd stood there with their mouths hanging open like fish gasping for air. Sold. Pike's gavel came down with a bang that seemed to echo off every building in town. To Samuel Hayes for $500. Samuel walked up the steps to the platform with that same slow, steady pace. The crowd watched in silence as he approached the woman. She heard his footsteps and tensed up like a rabbit sensing a hawk overhead. He stopped right in front of her, close enough that she could probably smell the leather of his coat and the soap he'd used that morning. For a long moment, he just stood there looking at her. Then he reached up with gentle hands and began working at the knot that held the sack around her neck. Easy now, he said quietly, his voice so low only she could hear it. You're safe. The rope came free, and the burlap sack fell to the platform with a soft thud. The woman beneath was beautiful enough to make angels weep. Her hair was the color of autumn wheat, falling in waves past her shoulders. Her skin was pale as cream, with high cheekbones and full lips that were currently pressed tight with fear. But it was her eyes that hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. They were green as spring grass, wide with terror, but blazing with a defiance that hadn't been broken despite everything she'd been through. She looked up at him, this tall stranger who just bought her like a piece of livestock, and waited for him to claim his prize. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone watching, including her. He took off his black coat and wrapped it gently around her shoulders. Then he leaned down, pulled a knife from his boot, and cut the ropes binding her wrists. She rubbed her hands together, wincing at the rope burns, never taking her eyes off his face. You're mine now, Samuel said, his voice carrying across the silent square. But the way he said it didn't sound like ownership. It sounded like a promise, a vow of protection. The woman's chin lifted, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and strong despite everything she'd been through. I belong to no man, she said. Not you, not anyone. Samuel almost smiled at that. Almost. We'll see about that, ma'am. For now, let's just get you somewhere safe. He offered her his arm, like a gentleman helping a lady down from a carriage instead of a man collecting his purchase. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, and together they walked down the platform steps and through the crowd toward his horse. Behind them, Jake Thornton watched with fury burning in his eyes. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That woman knew things. Things that could destroy him. And Samuel Hayes had just made himself an enemy more dangerous than any man in 3 states. As they reached Samuel's horse, the woman looked back at the crowd, then up at her unexpected savior. "Why?" she asked simply. Samuel helped her up onto the horse's back, his touch careful and respectful. "Because some things in this world are worth saving," he said. "And you, ma'am, are definitely one of them." As they rode away from the town square, neither of them noticed the 3 men on horseback following at a distance, their faces hidden beneath pulled-down hat brims and their hands resting on the guns at their sides. The sound of hoofbeats pounding against hard earth filled the canyon like thunder. Samuel's horse, a strong black stallion named Thunder, carried both riders through the narrow passage between towering red rocks. Grace held tight to Samuel's waist, her heart hammering in her chest as she looked back and saw dust clouds following them. "They're getting closer," she called out over the wind whipping past her ears. Samuel didn't answer, but she felt his muscles tense as he leaned forward, urging Thunder to run faster. The canyon walls blurred past them like a red river flowing in reverse. Behind them, the sound of their pursuers grew louder. 3 men, maybe 4, with guns and bad intentions. Samuel suddenly pulled hard on the reins, turning Thunder sharp to the left into what looked like solid rock wall. Grace gasped, thinking they were about to crash. But the last second she saw it, a narrow gap in the stone, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. They squeezed through just as bullets started flying, chips of rock exploding around them like deadly confetti. The hidden passage opened up into a green valley that took Grace's breath away. After the dusty, harsh landscape they'd been riding through, this place looked like something from a fairy tale. Tall grass swayed in the breeze. A clear stream ran down the middle, and cottonwood trees provided shade along the banks. At the far end of the valley sat a ranch house that looked like it belonged in a picture book. "Welcome to the Circle H Ranch," Samuel said as they slowed Thunder to a walk. His voice was calm now, like they hadn't just been running for their lives. Home. The house was bigger than Grace had expected, built from solid timber and stone with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Flower boxes sat under every window, filled with bright colors that someone clearly tended with care. A red barn stood nearby, along with a chicken coop, a vegetable garden, and corrals that held some of the finest horses Grace had ever seen. But it wasn't the buildings that made Grace's mouth fall open. It was the women. They came out of the house as Samuel and Grace approached, 5 women of different ages and backgrounds, all dressed in clean, well-fitting clothes. They moved with confidence, not fear. Their faces showed curiosity, not the beaten-down look Grace had seen on so many frontier women. These ladies looked happy. "Samuel," called out a woman with dark hair and kind brown eyes. She appeared to be in her 30s, wearing a blue dress that had been mended with care but showed quality fabric underneath. "We heard the shots. Are you all right?" "Fine, Maria," Samuel said as he helped Grace down from Thunder. "Just Jake Thornton's boys trying to cause trouble. This is Grace Morrison. She'll be staying with us for a while." Grace looked around at the faces watching her, unsure what to expect. In her experience, women could be just as cruel as men, especially to someone in her position. But what she saw in their eyes wasn't judgment or cruelty. It was understanding, like they knew exactly what she'd been through. A younger woman with red hair and freckles stepped forward. "I'm Sarah," she said with a warm smile. "You look like you could use a hot meal and a soft bed. And a bath," added another woman, this one older with gray streaks in her brown hair. "I'm Ruth. Come on, honey. Let's get you cleaned up and fed. You're safe now." Grace looked back at Samuel, confusion written all over her face. "I don't understand. Who are these women? What is this place?" Samuel handed Thunder's reins to a young man who'd appeared from a barn. "Walk with me," he said to Grace. "I'll explain everything." They strolled toward the house, the other women giving them space but staying close enough to help if needed. Samuel's boots clicked against the wooden porch steps as they climbed up to sit in two rocking chairs that faced the valley. 3 years ago, Samuel began, his voice quiet and distant. I had a wife named Elizabeth and a little girl named Emma. Emma was 6, with pigtails and a laugh that could make flowers bloom. She was everything good in this world rolled into one person. Grace saw pain flash across his face, the kind of deep hurt that never really heals. Fever came through town that winter. Took half the children and a lot of the adults too. Beth and Emma. I didn't make it. His voice broke just a little on those last words. I wanted to die right along with them. Probably would have, if not for the neighbors who kept bringing food, checking on me, making sure I didn't give up completely. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the peaceful valley. Grace waited, sensing there was more to the story. After I got through the worst of it, I started thinking about all the suffering in the world. How many people needed help but had nobody to turn to. That's when I heard about the auctions. His jaw tightened. Men selling women like cattle. Families so desperate they'd give up their daughters for a few dollars. It made me sick. So you decided to do something about it, Grace said quietly. Samuel nodded. Started small. Bought one woman. Gave her money to go back east to her family. Then another. Word got around, and soon I had women coming to me, asking for help. Some stayed on to help with the ranch. Others moved on when they were ready. But everyone's free to choose. Grace looked back at the women who were now preparing dinner, talking and laughing together. They all seemed so normal, happy even. Maria was sold by her father to pay gambling debts, Samuel explained. Sarah was being forced into marriage with a man 3 times her age. Ruth's husband died, and his brother was going to sell her to recover debts. They've all got stories, but they're not victims anymore. They're survivors. The front door opened, and Maria stepped out carrying a tray with coffee and fresh bread. Thought you two might be hungry, she said, setting it down on a small table between the chairs. Thank you, Grace said, surprised by the genuine kindness in the gesture. She took a bite of the bread and nearly groaned with pleasure. She hadn't eaten anything good in weeks. Maria makes the best bread in 3 counties, Samuel said with a smile that transformed his whole face. She's also our school teacher. Teaches the local children when they can make it out here. You run a school too? Grace asked. We do whatever needs doing, Maria replied. Ruth handles the medical needs. She was married to a doctor before he passed. Sarah manages the horses, and I handle the books and teaching. Samuel makes it all possible. After Maria went back inside, Samuel turned to Grace with serious eyes. I want to be clear about something. You don't owe me anything. Not work, not gratitude, nothing. You're free to leave whenever you want, and I'll give you money to get wherever you need to go. But you're also welcome to stay as long as you like. Your choice. Grace stared at him, tried to understand this man who just turned her world upside down. Why should I believe you? Men don't spend $500 without expecting something in return. Because, Samuel said simply, I've got more money than I'll ever need and nothing left to lose. Helping people like you gives my life meaning. It's how I honor Beth and Emma's memory. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Grace watched the colors change and felt something she hadn't experienced in months, peace. But under that peace was worry, eating at her like acid. There's something I need to tell you, she said finally. Something that might change your mind about helping me. Samuel waited, his face patient and calm. Grace took a deep breath. My name is Grace Morrison, and I'm not just running from poverty or a bad marriage. I'm running from Jake Thornton, the man who is bidding against you today. I used to work in his office, keeping his books, and I saw things. Terrible things. What kind of things? He's not just running auctions. He's got a whole network. Kidnapping, trafficking, murder. I have evidence, documents, names, dates. It's all sewn into the lining of my dress. She looked down at her hands. That's why he wanted to buy me today. Not because he needs another woman, but because I can destroy his entire operation." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Where's your family? Are they safe?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I have a son, Henry. He's 7 years old, and he's hiding in an old mine shaft about 10 miles from town. I was supposed to go back for him after I figured out what to do next." "We'll get him," Samuel said without hesitation. "You don't understand. Thornton will kill anyone who gets in his way. He's got the sheriff in his pocket, half the town council, and more guns than the army. If you help me, you're putting everyone here in danger." Samuel stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out at his peaceful valley. "Grace, these women here have all been through hell. They know what it's like to be hunted, to be afraid, to have nowhere to turn. You think any of them would want to turn you away because it might be dangerous?" As if summoned by his words, Maria appeared in the doorway. "Dinner's ready," she said. Then, looking at Grace's worried face, she added gently, "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." That's what families do. Grace felt tears start to fall. She'd been alone for so long, carrying this burden by herself, that the idea of having help seemed impossible. "Tomorrow morning, we ride out to get Henry," Samuel said firmly. "Tonight, you eat a good meal, sleep in a real bed, and stop carrying this load by yourself. You're not alone anymore." Grace Morrison. As they walked into the warm, lamp-lit house filled with the sounds of women talking and laughing, Grace felt something crack open in her chest. For the first time in months, she dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. But outside in the growing darkness, 3 riders sat on a ridge overlooking the hidden valley. Jake Thornton's men had found the secret entrance, and they were making plans of their own. Grace woke before dawn with ice in her veins. Something was wrong. She could feel in her bones the way some people could feel rain coming. Henry was in trouble. She dressed quickly and found Samuel already in the kitchen, drinking coffee by candlelight. His face told her he'd felt it too, that sense of danger hanging in the air like smoke from a fire you can't see yet. "We need to go now," Grace said simply. Samuel nodded and grabbed his gun belt from the hook by the door. "Maria's packing supplies. We'll take Thunder and Buttercup. They're fast and sure-footed." They rode hard through the pre-dawn darkness, following a trail that wound through rocky hills and scrub brush. Grace led the way, her heart pounding with every mile. The old silver mine where Henry was hiding sat in a canyon about 10 miles northeast of town, abandoned for years after the year played out. When they reached the canyon, Grace knew immediately that her worst fears had come true. The rope ladder Henry used to climb down into the mine shaft was torn and hanging loose. Scuff marks in the dirt showed signs of a struggle. "Henry," Grace called out, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Henry, are you there?" Silence. Samuel climbed down into the mine shaft with a lantern while Grace paced above, sick with worry. When he emerged, his face was grim. "He's not here," Samuel said. "But there are boot prints. At least 3 men, maybe 4. Looks like they found him yesterday afternoon." Grace felt her knees go weak. She sat down hard on a rock, struggling to breathe. "They have my baby. Oh God, they have my little boy." Samuel knelt beside her and spoke gently. "Grace, look at me. We're going to get him back. I promise you that." "How can you promise that? Thornton could have taken him anywhere. He could be dead already." "No," Samuel said firmly. "Thornton wants you and that evidence. Henry's no good to him dead. He's bait, which means he's alive, and Thornton will keep him that way." They followed the tracks back toward town, moving carefully and staying off the main roads. The trail led to a crossroads where it joined up with wagon ruts and became impossible to follow, but Samuel had other ideas. "We're going to town," he said, quietly. "Thornton's men will be talking, drinking, bragging about their success. Someone will know where they took him." Grace shook her head. "It's too dangerous. If Thornton sees us, he won't see us. I know places in that town Thornton's never heard of. Trust me." They left the horses hidden in a grove of trees outside town and walked in on foot as the sun was setting. Samuel led Grace through back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main roads where Thornton's men might be watching. They ended up behind Murphy's saloon, where Samuel had Grace wait while he slipped inside through the back door. Grace crouched in the shadows, listening to the sounds of men drinking and gambling inside. Every minute felt like an hour. What if Samuel was wrong? What if Henry was already? She pushed the thought away. She couldn't think like that. Samuel returned after what felt like forever, his face dark with anger. They've got him at Thornton's compound, about 5 miles north of town. Place is built like a fort, high walls, guards, dogs. But there's more. His jaw tightened. It's not just Henry. They've got other children too. 6 or 7 of them, maybe more. Thornton's planning another auction next month. Grace felt sick. Other children? How many more families is he destroying? That ends now, Samuel said grimly. But we can't do this alone. We need help. Who's going to help us? Thornton owns half the town. Samuel smiled grimly. How about friends? People who owe me favors. And there's something else you should know about me, Grace. Before I became a rancher, I was a federal marshal. I've still got connections with the law, the real law, not Thornton's bought men. They made their way back to the horses and rode hard for the ranch. Grace's mind was spinning with plans and fears, but underneath it all was a cold determination she'd never felt before. Thornton had made this personal. He'd taken her child. Now she was going to take everything from him. When they reached the ranch, the other women were waiting with worried faces. Samuel quickly explained the situation while Grace went to her room to retrieve something she'd kept hidden. She returned carrying a small leather pouch, her fingers shaking as she opened it. Inside were folded papers covered with numbers and names in her careful handwriting. This is it, she said. 3 years of Thornton's business. Every sale, every payment, every name. Politicians, lawmen, businessmen, they're all here. This could bring down his entire operation. Maria looked at the papers with wide eyes. Grace, this is enough evidence to hang half the territory. Then we use it, Samuel said. But first, we get Henry and those other children to safety. Ruth, I need you to ride to Carson City and find Marshall Williams. Tell him Samuel Hayes needs help with a federal case. Give him these papers. What about us? Sarah asked. We're going after the children, Samuel said simply. Tonight. Grace looked around at these women who barely knew her, but were ready to risk their lives for her son. For the first time since this nightmare began, she didn't feel alone. Thornton's compound is heavily guarded, she said, but I worked in his office for 2 years. I know the layout, the guard schedules, everything. If we're smart about this, we can get in and out without anyone getting hurt. Samuel checked his guns and looked around at the determined faces. Then let's go bring those children home. As they prepared to leave, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not just hope, but certainty. They were going to win this fight. They had to. Too many lives depended on it. The compound lay ahead in the darkness. But for the first time since this began, Grace Morrison wasn't afraid of what waited there. The moon was nothing more than a silver sliver in the black sky when Samuel, Grace, and Maria crept through the tall grass toward Thornton's compound. The place looked like a fortress, with high wooden walls topped with barbed wire and guard towers at each corner. Lanterns cast yellow circles of light every 50 feet, and they could hear dogs barking somewhere inside. Guard changes in 10 minutes, Grace whispered, checking the pocket watch Samuel had given her. That's our window. Samuel nodded and checked his guns one more time. Maria clutched a bag of supplies, rope, bandages, and food for the children they hoped to rescue. All 3 of them wore dark clothes and had dirt smeared on their faces to avoid reflecting moonlight. Remember, Grace said quietly, the children's building is on the north side, past the main house. There's a cellar door that's usually locked, but I know where Thornton keeps the spare key. They waited in the shadows as footsteps approached on the other side of the wall. A guard walked past their hiding spot, his lantern swinging lazily. He looked bored and tired, exactly what they hoped for. The moment he disappeared around the corner, Samuel boosted Grace up and over the wall. She landed softly in the dirt courtyard and looked around quickly. No movement. She signaled to the others, and soon all three were inside enemy territory. The compound was bigger than it looked from outside. Besides the main house where Thornton lived, there were stables, storage buildings, and what looked like barracks for his men. Grace led them carefully between buildings, avoiding the patches of light cast by the lanterns. They were almost to the children's building when disaster struck. A dog started barking somewhere close by. Then another joined in. Within seconds, the whole pack was raising hell, and lights began flickering on in windows across the compound. "Run," Samuel hissed. They sprinted the last 100 yards to a low wooden building with barred windows. Grace's hands shook as she felt around the doorframe for the hidden key. Behind them, they could hear men shouting and boots running on wooden porches. "Got it." Grace found the key and jammed it into the lock. The door swung open, revealing stone steps leading down into darkness. The smell hit them first, unwashed bodies, fear, and sickness. Then they heard the crying, soft, frightened sobs coming from the shadows below. Samuel lit a small lantern as they hurried down the steps. What they found made Grace's heart break into pieces. 7 children, ranging from about 5 to 12 years old, huddled together on dirty blankets. Their clothes were torn and filthy, their faces thin from hunger. "Henry!" Grace spotted her son in the corner and ran to him. He looked up with eyes that had seen too much, then threw himself into her arms. "Mama, I knew you'd come. I knew it." His voice was hoarse from crying, but he was alive and seemed unharmed. "Are you hurt, baby?" Grace checked him over quickly while Samuel and Maria helped the other children to their feet. "I'm okay, Mama, but the other kids are scared. Some of them are sick." Samuel knelt down to the children's level. "I'm Samuel, and this is Maria. We're here to take you home to your families. Can everyone walk?" A little girl with blonde pigtails shook her head. "My leg hurts real bad, mister. They made me work in the kitchen, and I fell down." Maria examined her quickly. "Looks like a sprained ankle. I can carry her." Above them, the shouting was getting closer. Dogs were barking right outside the building now. "We need to go," Samuel said urgently. "Now." They helped the children up the stairs, Samuel carrying the smallest boy and Maria supporting the girl with the hurt ankle. Grace held Henry's hand tight, afraid to let him go even for a second. But when they reached the top of the stairs, their hearts sank. The door had been slammed shut and they could hear voices right outside. "I know they're in there, boss," came a rough voice. "Dogs led us right to him." "Good," replied a voice that made Grace's blood turn to ice. Jake Thornton himself. "Mrs. Morrison and her new friends walked right into my trap. Bar that door. They're not going anywhere." Samuel tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. "Is there another way out?" Samuel asked Grace quietly. Grace thought hard, trying to remember the building's layout from when she'd worked in Thornton's office. There's a root cellar that connects to the main house. It was used during Indian raids years ago. They found the narrow tunnel behind a stack of old crates. It was barely wide enough for an adult to crawl through, but it was their only chance. One by one, they helped the children into the dark passage. Henry went first, being brave for the younger kids. "It's okay," he told a little boy who was crying. "My mama says we're going home." The tunnel seemed to go on forever, with dirt falling in their faces and the sound of their own breathing echoing off the walls. Behind them, they could hear Thornton's men breaking down the cellar door. They emerged in the basement of the main house, dusty and exhausted, but alive. Samuel helped the last child out of the tunnel, just as they heard boots thundering down the stairs behind them. "This way," Grace whispered, leading them toward a window she remembered from her time working here. It was small, but the children could fit through. They were lifting the last child through the window when the basement door burst open. Thornton stood there with 4 of his men, all holding guns. Well, Thornton said with an evil smile. "Looks like our guests have been busy. Boys, I think it's time we had a little talk about the price of stealing from Jake Thornton. Samuel stepped in front of Grace and the children, his hand moving slowly toward his gun. The room was full of tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Outside, they could hear horses approaching fast. Either rescue was coming, or more of Thornton's men. In a few seconds, they'd know which one it was. Grace clutched Henry to her chest and prayed they hadn't come this far, just to fail now. The sound of horses grew louder, and Thornton's smile got wider. That'll be more of my boys coming back from town. You picked a bad night to play hero, Hayes. Samuel kept his hand near his gun, his eyes never leaving Thornton's face. Let the children go, Jake. This is between you and me. No, no, no. Thornton shook his head like he was talking to a stupid child. This is between me and Mrs. Morrison there. She's got something that belongs to me, and I want it back. Grace stepped forward, her chin raised high despite the fear in her eyes. You mean the evidence of your crimes? The names of all the politicians you bought? The records of every child you've stolen? Thornton's face went red with anger. You think you're so smart, don't you? Well, let me tell you something, lady. Those papers won't do you any good if you're dead. That's when the basement door burst open again, and Grace's heart nearly stopped. But instead of more of Thornton's men, 3 figures in dark coats stepped into the room. The leader was a tall man with a silver badge pinned to his chest and steel gray eyes that had seen everything twice. U.S. Marshal Williams, the man announced in a voice that filled the room, and you're all under arrest. Thornton spun around, his mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. What? How did you? This is my property. You got no right. We got every right, Marshal Williams said calmly. Thanks to some very interesting documents that were delivered to my office this evening. Documents that show you've been running a kidnapping and trafficking operation across 3 territories. Behind the marshal, 2 deputies stepped into view with their guns drawn. Grace recognized one of them. It was Ruth from the ranch, dressed in men's clothes with a deputy's badge on her coat. Ruth, Grace gasped. Ruth winked at her. Turns out I used to be married to a federal judge before my doctor husband. I still have some friends in high places. Thornton looked around the room like a trapped animal. You can't prove nothing. It's their word against mine. Actually, Marshal Williams said, pulling out a familiar leather folder, we can prove quite a lot. Mrs. Morrison kept very detailed records. Names, dates, amounts of money, locations, everything we need to shut down your whole operation. Samuel finally relaxed his gun hand, but he kept his body between the children and Thornton's men. What about his men outside? No, Thornton screamed, reaching for his own gun. But Samuel was faster. His Colt appeared in his hand like magic, and Thornton found himself staring down the barrel before he could clear leather. I wouldn't, Samuel said quietly. You've caused enough pain for one lifetime. Thornton's shoulders sagged as he realized it was over. The deputies moved in and cuffed him and his men while Marshal Williams read them their rights. What about the children? Grace asked, holding Henry tight. We'll get them back to their families, the marshal promised. The ones who have families left. The others, well, I hear you folks run a pretty good place for children who need homes. Grace looked at Samuel, who nodded. There's always room for more at the Circle H Ranch. As the deputies led Thornton away, he turned back to Grace with hate burning in his eyes. This ain't over, Morrison. Even from prison, I got reach. I'll find you. No, you won't, Samuel said firmly, stepping up beside Grace. Because she's not going to be Grace Morrison much longer. Grace looked at him in surprise. What do you mean? Samuel took her hand, his voice gentle but sure. I mean, if you'll have me, you're going to be Grace Hayes. My wife, my partner, my equal in everything. What do you say? Grace felt tears start to flow, but for the first time in years, they were happy tears. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Samuel Hayes. I'll marry you. Henry tugged on Samuel's coat. Does that mean you'll be my pa? Samuel knelt down and looked the boy in the eyes. If you want me to be, son. If you want me to be. I do. Henry threw his arms around Samuel's neck. I always wanted a pa who could shoot bad guys. Outside, the sun was starting to rise over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The nightmare was over. Thornton was going to prison, his network was destroyed, and the children were safe. But for Grace, Samuel, and Henry, this wasn't an ending at all. It was just the beginning of something beautiful, something worth fighting for, something called family. 3 months later, the Circle H Ranch looked like something out of a dream. White ribbons fluttered from every fence post and porch rail. Wildflowers filled mason jars on tables scattered across the yard, and the smell of Maria's famous apple pies drifted through the warm spring air. Grace stood in front of the bedroom mirror, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. The white dress Maria had sewn for her was simple but beautiful, made from fabric Samuel had ordered all the way from Denver. Her hair was pinned up with small white flowers, and for the first time in years, her face showed nothing but pure happiness. "You look like an angel, Mama," Henry said from the doorway. He was dressed in his first real suit, his hair slicked down with pomade that made him wrinkle his nose. "Pa's gonna faint when he sees you." Grace smiled at how naturally Henry had started calling Samuel Pa. From the very first day they'd returned to the ranch, the boy had attached himself to Samuel like a shadow, helping with chores and hanging on every word. Samuel had been just as smitten, teaching Henry to ride and whittle and all the things a father should teach a son. "Is everyone here?" Grace asked, smoothing her dress nervously. "Everyone, and then some," Henry grinned. Marshall Williams came back with his whole family. Even some folks from town showed up, the good ones, anyway. And all those families whose kids we saved, they all came to say thank you. Ruth peeked her head in the door. "Time to go, honey. Your groom's about to wear a hole in the porch from pacing." Grace took one last look in the mirror, took a deep breath, and walked outside into her new life. The ceremony was held under the big cottonwood tree beside the stream, with Marshall Williams officiating since he was licensed to perform weddings in his territory. Samuel stood waiting in his best black suit, his silver hair combed back and his blue eyes shining as he watched Grace walk toward him. All the rescued women stood together as her bridesmaids, dressed in matching yellow dresses they'd sewn together over the past month. The rescued children sat in the front row with their families, clean and healthy and smiling. Even some of the townspeople who'd opposed Thornton had come to celebrate. When Grace reached Samuel's side, he took her hands and looked into her eyes like she was the only person in the world. "Grace Morrison," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. 3 months ago, I bought you at an auction, thinking I was saving you. But you saved me instead. You brought life back to my heart and joy back to my home." "Samuel Hayes," Grace replied, her voice steady and sure. "You gave me freedom when I had none, hope when I'd lost it all, and love when I thought I'd never find it. You showed me that your mind doesn't mean ownership, it means belonging to each other." Marshall Williams smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife. "You may kiss your bride, Samuel." The kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise for all the years to come. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and Henry hooped loud enough to be heard in the next county. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with dancing and music and more food than anyone could eat. Grace watched Samuel teaching some of the younger children how to skip stones in the stream, and her heart felt so full she thought it might burst. As the sun set and the guests began to head home, Grace found herself alone with Samuel on the porch where they'd first talked that day he'd brought her here. "Any regrets?" Samuel asked, taking her hand. "Only one," Grace said, and Samuel's face grew concerned. "I regret that it took so long for us to find each other." Samuel laughed and pulled her close. "Well, Mrs. Hayes, we've got the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." "Mrs. Hayes," Grace repeated, testing out the sound of it. "I like that. I like it very much." A year later, Marshall Williams visited the ranch again, but this time it wasn't for business. He came to see the thriving community that had grown around the Circle H. The ranch now housed 12 women and 15 children, all free and happy and building new lives. Grace had started a school for the children, while Samuel worked with federal authorities to shut down trafficking operations across 3 states. Maria ran a successful bakery in town. Ruth had opened a medical clinic, and Sarah trained horses that were bought by ranchers from as far away as California. But the best part of all was watching Grace, Samuel, and Henry together. They'd become a real family, complete with a new baby girl named Elizabeth Emma Hayes, after the wife and daughter Samuel had lost years before. On quiet evenings, Samuel would sit on the porch with his wife and children, looking out over the peaceful valley that had become home to so many lost souls. Grace would rest her head on his shoulder while Henry played with his baby sister, and Samuel would remember that day at the auction when he'd said, "You're mine." He'd meant it as protection then. Now he knew it was so much more. They belonged to each other, not as property, but as partners, lovers, and family. 2 broken people who'd found healing and love and purpose in helping others. The ranch continued its mission, welcoming new arrivals and sending them on to better lives when they were ready. But Samuel and Grace never left. They'd found their home, their purpose, and their happiness in that hidden valley where love had conquered everything that tried to destroy it. And they lived happily ever after.